Hello and welcome to another edition of The Big Picture, the show where we try to take you beyond the news to understand the processes that are driving news events and their implications. Last week, August 31st, was when the National Register of Citizens process in Assam reached a conclusion. This was a Supreme Court ordered and closely monitored process. 1.9 million residents of Assam were excluded from the final list. The entire NRC process has thrown up key questions about Indian democracy, about Indian citizenship, about identity-based politics, about judicial intervention, about bureaucratic procedures. To discuss all these issues, I have with me today a very distinguished guest. Yamini Aiyar is President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research, one of Delhi's finest research institutes and think tanks. Yamini is also a columnist with the Hindustan Times. Thank you, Yamini, for joining us.
Thank you.
Let me begin with a somewhat simplistic question. In the minds of many people, the NRC process is a legitimate process because the framing of it is this. Indian citizens have a right to live in India. They must be recognized and rewarded with these rights. Illegal immigrants must be detected and weeded out. This framing of the NRC process as one between citizens and illegal immigrants, does it do justice to our understanding of NRC and how it's played out? Or do you think there are some flaws in that conception?
So, on principle, a country needs to have a framework of determination of who are its legal citizens based on how the Constitution determines and defines citizenship. Just on that principle, I have no real quibble as such. But I think to understand how citizenship is determined in India, one needs to also recognize a historical context of partition in which there was a mass movement of people, new nations were created, and new forms of citizenship were determined through that process. And in that process, the mechanisms of fluidity across borders became far more complex than one even understands, than the Indian imagination is able to capture today, because now we've had a long gap and many generations have passed since partition. And so even though the principle of it is not one that one can quibble with, the way in which our borders were created and the fluidity and movement across our borders did create certain kinds of grey zones. And it is in those grey zones that the narrative of the NRC has emerged in the first place. So although the principle makes sense, the context in which the tool of determining who is a legitimate citizen and who is not a legitimate citizen, which has now been framed in the NRC, is, I think, problematic. Problematic because it doesn't take into account that historical complexity and fluidity which led to the present situation in the first place, and also problematic because over the decades, multiple forms of identity claiming, both ethnic, social, cultural, and religious, have now got intertwined into what today is the tool of the NRC. And it's very important to separate these out to try and recognize very legitimate claims and legitimate processes for determining citizenship and identifying illegal immigrants, as well as legitimate claims of identity and assertions and ethnic assertions, which need to be negotiated as you come to some conclusion over who is a legal citizen and who isn't.
You mentioned the complexity, and we know that the roots of the NRC process lie in the Assam agitation that took place 3 decades ago. I'll talk about the politics of the NRC a bit later, but it eventually happened because of the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. The court was extremely active, proactive in pushing this process through. It did not give, it was strict on timelines, it was strict on criteria. And it's interesting that the push did not come as much from the political executive as from the judiciary. What do you make of this kind of judicial intervention in such a historically complex context?
So I think there are two things here, and I know we'll come to the politics in a bit, but the fact of the matter is that every conversation on the NRC takes you back to 1985 and takes you back to the Assam Accord. There has been, this was seen as one way of, whether it was through the NRC or the IMDT, but there was a legitimate determination that took place when the Assam Accord was signed to address this issue of illegal immigrants into Assam. And I think politically, the inability of the political regimes of the time, the Congress and even briefly the BJP, their inability to move then has, I think, contributed to the chaos and confusion that we see now. And like traditionally, if you look at the relationship between politics and judiciary in India, whenever you see political inaction, and I think that political inaction also happened because politicians themselves realized how fraught this was, and in which vote bank will be more impacted by going through with something like the NRC must have very much been on their minds. But that opens up the space for the judiciary to come in. And the minute you have judicial intervention on complex socio-cultural issues, inevitably you see a complete overdetermination of how a problem needs to be solved, which creates real chaos on the ground. But I think in the specific context of the NRC, a lot more serious engagement needs to be had with how the judiciary has behaved. Back from in 2005, when this issue reached the Supreme Court, the determination of the Supreme Court up to 2013, and why is it that the Supreme Court insisted on the NRC, despite the fact that there were a number of questions that actually needed to be legally understood and constitutionally determined in terms of what the court had seen as question marks on the IMDT. And even as a bench was supposed to address this, the court insisted that we go through with the NRC process. And, that's also opened up the window now post NRC to say we should have done citizenship amendment first and then NRC, precisely because those contours of what determines legal citizenship have not yet been finalized, and we've run off to do the NRC. Once we determine to do the NRC, court intervention, on principle, court intervention would ensure that this is in fact a completely objective process, and that it would not have allowed any of the communalization and other elements that crept into the NRC to come in, because after all, it is the court that is monitoring it, the bureaucracy is implementing it, and it's keeping all the politicians out. But an over-enthusiastic and over-interventionist court, it leads to the kinds of problems you saw as the NRC unfolded. The court giving deadlines that were unrealistic. After all, the court is not the bureaucracy. The court is not on the ground. So the court doesn't understand the complexities of doing even very simple things, given the nature of the Indian bureaucracy. The court saying there will be 10 documents, then it says no, there will be 5, then it says okay, there will be 15. All of that throughout the process, creating a lot of confusion and lost in translation on the ground. And the human costs of that, just the amount of running around that the ordinary citizen had, that the ordinary resident had to do to prove citizenship, really tells you that too much judicial intervention in areas where the judiciary should not be there in the first place can lead to very serious problems. And I think the NRC is a very sad illustration of just that.
The other example of an institution whose role must be interrogated, that you mentioned in your column last week for the Hindustan Times, is the bureaucracy. And you said something interesting in the column, that this was the government not trusting its own documents and making its own documents a tool of coercion. Would you like to explain what you really meant by that?
So, look, traditionally, if you go back in history to the East India Company, Indian administration, whether it was colonial administration or now down to the present day, has always been wedded to paper. The papers and the files are, just you walk into a bureaucrat's office and you've seen those piles and piles and piles. Lots of political scientists and anthropologists have written about describing India as the paper state, or the Indian bureaucracy as having a passion for paper. And in some ways, this passion for paper has been the mechanism by which the bureaucracy goes about getting things done. It has served as a very powerful tool in the hands of the bureaucracy, precisely because it allows it to create a form of government, and then it uses that form of government and functionality as a way of closing off for people. So if you're not on the file, if your name is not on the file, if your name is not on the document, then the bureaucracy can't do anything for you. And the NRC is exactly that. If your name is not on that list, you're not a citizen. But at the same time, the bureaucracy's relationship with its own paper and citizens' relationship with bureaucracy's paperwork is a very complex one. At one level, the fact that the Indian bureaucracy is so carefully managed on paper has also proven to be a huge tool in the hands of citizens. Think about the right to information. What was it? It was citizens taking the government's passion for paper and turning it around, saying, this is my power now. I will take your paper and I will ask you questions and place claims of accountability on you. So that's where citizens have used it effectively. Any resident of India that has the right documentation that government has supplied to it, birth certificate, land records, so on and so forth, is an empowered citizen, because the citizen then can take these documents to government and say that I'm making claims. I am a genuine citizen of India. So in both ways, this paperwork can be hugely empowering. But what if you are on the margins? What if you don't have the appropriate paperwork? Or what if government itself has failed to give you the right kind of paperwork? Now, we are a very inefficient bureaucracy. Even though we believe everything has to be on paper, the way we manage and handle our paper for a whole set of other reasons linked to our weak state capacity is weak. Think about it. Even when you apply for your passports or your birth certificates, in the days before we used to give a biometric identification for passports, it had the wrong spelling. My own passport had the wrong spelling of my last name. It had taken my parents' first name and middle name and merged them into one. And so, suddenly you got a document that wasn't really authentic because it was misspelling, and you compare that with your birth certificate, and I could be one of the NRC excluded, right? So so government recognizes its own failures, and it's quite suspicious of its own papers, which is why you constantly have verification, and which is actually what has opened up this whole dynamic of Aadhaar, biometrics, etc. It's about government saying, I'm kind of suspicious of my own ability to judge my paper. I'm also suspicious of whether I've given you the right paper or you bought the right paper off me, and therefore I'm now going to place the onus on you to prove to me that my papers are correct. So it inverts itself completely, and in that inversion, you can take something that in some ways is very empowering for citizens and also make it completely disempowering to citizens. It allows government to cast suspicion on its documents, and then these suspicious documents become the way in which it's deciding whether you are legal or not, whether you have rights on claims of, and the rights of claims of most of those who have been left out of the NRC are about their basic needs. It's about housing, it's about ration, it's about government subsidy, and suddenly you lose that because the government became suspicious of its own documents.
The third dimension of it, besides the judicial and the bureaucratic, is of course the politics. We know that a clear subtext of the politics around NRC has been the BJP's belief in particular that India is inundated with Muslim illegal immigrants, and this would be a process which would detect them. Now, it's interesting that the final list is something that has not pleased the BJP. It also seems to have had a very large number of Bengali Hindus who are excluded. Now, this is where your point, which you made in the column, that the entire process is now, there is an intersection with the politics of religion. Do you think that we are now moving into a new definition of citizenship, especially if they bring in the Citizenship Amendment Bill in the next session, which is what they have promised, which moves away from the constitutional vision of citizenship so far?
Oh, absolutely. I think let's go back to the first question that you had asked about, the first principle of an exercise like the NRC, or rather just the first principle of determining who is a legal citizen. In some senses, this whole issue, which emerged out of a fairly legitimate identity claim, which was ethnic, which was regional, has actually been completely monopolized by a very different narrative, which is a claim of citizenship on the basis of religion. Remember the rhetoric that we heard through the elections, infiltrators, termites, all of that was layering on a construction that I don't believe was the core construction of the agitation of the late 70s and 80s that led us to the NRC in the first place. So in some ways, the agenda has just been taken over. And as soon as it became clear, and to be honest, it became clear in 2018 when the draft list was out as well, that this may not go in the direction that the BJP had certainly expected it to go. You saw the beginnings of the government using its own, suspicious documents in its favor, saying, I'm not actually trusting the NRC process suddenly. So suddenly now, in the way in which the NRC process is being questioned by the BJP, you're also now casting questions and doubts on the Supreme Court and its ability to monitor, on the government and the bureaucracy and its ability to get something like this this right. And these might be very legitimate things to be questioning, but they are being used now in the context of a larger narrative around religion.
But what do you make of the question? Sorry to interrupt you. Of the belief that this is the natural home of Hindus and Sikhs and minorities in other countries in the neighborhood when they are persecuted.
I believe very strongly that India is a natural home of all religions, and India should open itself up to its neighborhood and to communities in its neighborhood that are coming in when they feel a sense of persecution, regardless of their religion. I think that we have made it very clear in our international response to the Rohingya crisis that we are now allowing religion to creep in, and our entire policy on immigrants and refugees is going through a fundamental transition different to the way we looked at it back in our early independence years. And layering the Citizenship Act onto this, the amendment bill onto this, is a fundamental shift of who is Indian. This was not the constitutional imagination. Of course, there was always this tension, and this tension has very much played out even if we go back in the history of how the Supreme Court interventions have taken place on this question of citizenship. There has always been this tension, but the constitutional imagination of a religion-neutral citizenship was always served as a check and balance. If we do go down the road of this amendment, I fear that that check and balance will go, and being an Indian and being a Hindu will completely change what India was and India's own rejection of the two-nation theory of 1947.
My final question. There is a possibility that the BJP will push for a nationwide NRC. What does that mean?
I think that the BJP would be wise to draw lessons from its misadventure in Assam. I think that a nationwide NRC will be complete and utter chaos and disaster. Just take away the politics, just our sheer bureaucratic capability, we don't have the ability to do this. There's a very nice little case study that I found last year, actually, when I was writing on the draft NRC for the Hindustan Times, done by an ethnographer in Odisha. Exactly the same story. Bengali Hindu migrants came in 1971 or just after. Fishermen folk, a community that found itself a home, which through a process similar to the NRC suddenly became illegal. We have no idea what to do with them, and they're just living in this village in Odisha as stateless people with no rights. The consequences in a very weak state system can be one of deep coercion that will harm the most marginalized of Indians. I think we should steer away from this. Of course, this doesn't take away from the need to have a more sensible conversation about how we handle movement of people, how we handle illegal immigration, how we handle our borders. I'm not being romantic about it. I'm not saying that India should open up its arms and, at the cost of its own legal citizens in terms of the rights that they have. But we should have a sensible conversation about how best this can be done without taking away the basic dignity and rights of people.
Thank you so much, Yamini. This was deeply thoughtful and insightful for our viewers. Join us for the next edition of The Big Picture next week.